Springfield, Vermont, was like a picture-perfect postcard of quiet, cozy town where everyone knew each other, and each day seemed to blend seamlessly into the next. Springfield was a place where time seemed to have stopped, preserving the ideal of the small American dream. Among the neat houses with well-kept lawns and white picket fences stood the Bennett family home on one of the town's most prestigious streets. Robert Bennett, the head of the family, was a respected businessman. He had built his construction company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful in the county. At 50, Robert embodied discipline and perseverance. His reputation as a man of his word made him not only successful but also revered in the community. Sarah Bennett, his wife, was a beloved teacher at the local school. At 48, her kindness and compassion remained undiminished. She always knew how to connect with each student, and her classes were highly sought after. Sarah was the heart of the family, always supporting her children and husband, ensuring that their home remained a place of comfort and peace. Thomas and Emily, the Bennett children, seemed like the perfect teenagers. Thomas, who had just turned 18, was preparing to attend college, planning to follow in his father's footsteps in business. Emily, a 16-year-old with a bright and artistic disposition, dreamed of becoming an artist. She often secluded herself in her room, painting her emotions and feelings on canvas. But behind this picture-perfect family facade lay a secret that threatened to destroy everything. Thomas and Emily, who had grown up side by side, had always been close. Their bond, initially innocent and childlike, had begun to take on darker forms over time. Thomas, usually calm and composed, had always been the dependable older brother, but in recent years, his feelings towards Emily started to change. He found it increasingly difficult to see her as just a little sister, feeling something deep in his heart that both frightened and burdened him. Yet he couldn't fight these feelings. He began to notice that his thoughts about Emily were becoming obsessive. Attempts to drown them out with schoolwork and sports only deepened his inner conflict. Emily, on her part, began to sense something unusual in Thomas's behavior. She couldn't understand why he had become so distant and withdrawn, or why his eyes sometimes held a strange glint when they were alone. At times, she caught herself realizing that her feelings toward him exceeded the boundaries of typical sibling affection. Her teenage emotions, fueled by her passion for artistic self-expression, only amplified her confusion. She painted images where her feelings for Thomas were hidden beneath layers of symbolism and allegory. Their secret connection, which they were afraid to even acknowledge, began to alter their relationship. They increasingly found excuses to be alone, hiding from prying eyes, unaware that their behavior had already begun to attract attention. By May 2023, Thomas and Emily began spending more time together in secluded places where no one could see them. They started meeting in the woods outside town, venturing further from home so that no one would notice their disappearances. During this time, their bond grew even stronger, and they both knew they were on the brink of something they could no longer control. Thomas, overwhelmed by his emotions, tried to find a way out. He contemplated leaving home or suppressing his feelings, but each time, his thoughts returned to Emily, as if she were his inevitable fate. In June 2023, Emily, feeling that the situation had become unbearable, began writing a diary, detailing her feelings for her brother. These entries became her only way to express everything she couldn't say out loud. However, this diary, hidden under her pillow, became another link in the chain of events leading to tragedy. By July 2023, their secret meetings continued, and the tension between them grew. Detective Julia Harper, who had noticed their strange behavior, began her own investigation. Suspecting that something much darker lurked behind the facade of the perfect Bennett family, she knew that time was running out, and that something irreversible might happen if she didn't act quickly. By August 2023, the once peaceful world of Thomas and Emily was beginning to crack. Emily began to suffer from constant guilt and shame, waking up in cold sweats after nightmares. She feared looking her parents in the eye, worried they would see the secret she so carefully concealed. She became withdrawn, abandoning her painting and distancing herself from her friends. Thomas, on the other hand, struggled with darker thoughts. His obsession with Emily grew more intense, and he became irritable and aggressive. He started avoiding his father, fearing Robert would discover his feelings. His walks became longer and darker, and he could no longer control the voices in his head, condemning him for his love for Emily. The Bennett's neighbor, Gary, began to notice their odd behavior. Gary, always a keen observer, had been friends with Robert for years and admired the family's closeness. But now, something was clearly wrong. He saw Thomas and Emily sneaking out late at night and meeting in the woods. As these nighttime outings became more frequent, Gary grew increasingly concerned. In September 2023, unable to stay silent any longer, Gary contacted Detective Julia Harper and shared his suspicions. Detective Harper, who already had her doubts about the Bennett family, decided to launch a full investigation. She knew time was running out. By October 2023, the tension between Thomas and Emily reached its peak. Thomas became increasingly aggressive, even stalking Emily and following her everywhere. Emily felt trapped, knowing that her brother's obsession had spiraled out of control. One evening, when their parents were at work, Thomas locked himself in Emily's room, refusing to let her out until they talked. His voice had a threatening tone, and Emily realized that her brother might soon act on his threats. Desperate, Emily agreed to Thomas's plan to run away together. They began preparing for their escape, planning to leave town and disappear into the night. But on the night of their planned departure, as they packed their things in silence, Robert Bennett discovered them. He demanded to know what was going on, his voice growing more threatening by the second. Thomas, panicked and desperate, pushed his father down the stairs in a fit of rage. Robert fell, hitting his head on the wooden steps. Emily screamed, rushing to her father's side, but it was too late. Robert lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs. Their world shattered in an instant. Emily, terrified and in shock, grabbed Thomas's hand and urged him to run. They fled the house into the dark streets of Springfield, not looking back. By December 2023, Thomas and Emily were on the run, haunted by guilt and paranoia. They couldn't trust anyone, not even each other. They hid in shadows, constantly looking over their shoulders, convinced that someone was chasing them. Their escape had turned into a living nightmare. On December 20th, 2023, after weeks of hiding, they found refuge in an abandoned house. Detective Linda Morris, having tracked them down through surveillance footage, surrounded the house with officers. Thomas and Emily didn't resist. Emily broke down in hysteria while Thomas sat silently, detached from reality. When the police searched the house, they found diaries and letters revealing the dark emotions that had consumed the siblings. These writings became key evidence in the trial, showing how their forbidden relationship had spiraled into obsession and destruction. On March 25, 2024, Thomas and Emily were sentenced to prison for the murder of their father. Thomas received 25 years, while Emily was sentenced to 20 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment. The town of Springfield would never be the same. The Bennett house, once a symbol of success, became a grim monument to tragedy, with locals whispering about the curse that seemed to linger there. Though the town returned to its routine, the story of the Bennett family became a warning, passed down in hushed tones, a reminder that even the quietest of places can harbor the darkest secrets. As the town of Springfield tried to return to normalcy, the shadow of the Bennett tragedy loomed large over the once peaceful streets. The white picket-fenced homes, which once symbolized security and serenity, now seemed haunted by whispers of the past. For years, no one dared approach the old Bennett house, which had quickly fallen into disrepair after the trial. Weeds overtook the garden, windows cracked from neglect, and the once pristine home became a ghostly relic of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Despite the silence surrounding the Bennett family, their story persisted in the form of local folklore. Some claimed to see strange lights flickering in the windows of the abandoned house late at night. Others said they heard whispers in the wind when they walked past, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak of the horrors they had witnessed. Parents began warning their children not to go near the Bennett house, spinning eerie tales of a family cursed by forbidden love. The story of Thomas and Emily Bennett became a cautionary tale for a generation of Springfield's youth, how even the closest bonds could spiral into darkness if left unchecked. Years passed, and the Bennett tragedy morphed into legend. The house remained empty, a symbol of the town's darkest secret, until an investor from out of town purchased it in 2027, hoping to renovate and sell it. However, the new owner encountered problems from the start. Contractors refused to work on the house, citing strange occurrences, tools going missing, electrical malfunctions, and unexplained sounds echoing through the empty halls. Eventually, work on the house came to a halt, leaving it half restored, its eerie aura intact. But while the physical house stood as a monument to the past, Thomas and Emily's lives took very different paths in the years following their incarceration. Both siblings had been sent to separate prisons, with strict orders that they were never to communicate with each other again. Their mental states continued to deteriorate in isolation. The weight of their guilt, compounded by the trauma of their father's death, pushed them deeper into despair. Emily, struggling with her overwhelming feelings of guilt and grief, spent most of her time in solitary confinement. She rarely spoke to anyone, withdrawing into herself more and more each day. The few times she did interact with prison psychologists, she would only speak about the nightmares she had of her father's death, her voice shaking as she described his body lying lifeless at the bottom of the stairs. She constantly saw his face in her dreams, and in the waking world, she felt his presence watching her from the shadows. Her mental health worsened with each passing year, leading to several episodes of self-harm. Emily found herself trapped in a never-ending cycle of guilt and despair, unable to move past what had happened. In the rare letters she wrote but never sent, she begged for forgiveness from her father, her brother, and even herself. But forgiveness never came, and she spent her days consumed by the belief that she deserved her fate. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed to succumb fully to his delusions. His obsession with Emily, which had once driven his actions, had now become his entire world. Despite being separated from her, he still believed that they were connected, that their bond, twisted as it was, transcended prison walls. He often spoke out loud to his father, hearing the voice of Robert Bennett in his mind, accusing him of betrayal and condemning him for destroying the family. The hallucinations became more frequent, and Thomas's grip on reality slipped further with each passing year. The prison staff took note of Thomas's behavior, recognizing the need for psychiatric care, but his condition continued to worsen. In his mind, the line between past and present blurred, and he became fixated on the idea that Emily was calling out to him, needing him to save her. His letters, filled with desperate declarations of love and pleas for reunion, were never sent. They piled up in his cell, a testament to his unraveling psyche. By the time 5 years had passed, both Thomas and Emily had faded into obscurity within the prison system. Their story, once the subject of national headlines, was now largely forgotten by the outside world. Only the people of Springfield remembered, and even they had begun to move on, pushing the memory of the Bennett tragedy into the recesses of their minds. In 2030, a decade after the murder, the Bennett house caught fire under mysterious circumstances. The blaze consumed the entire structure, leaving nothing but charred remains. No one knew how the fire had started, but rumors quickly spread. Some speculated that it had been an accident caused by vagrants squatting in the abandoned home. Others whispered that the house itself had been cursed, and that the fire was a final act of destruction, cleansing the land of the horrors that had taken place there. Regardless of the cause, the fire marked the end of the physical reminder of the Bennett family's fall. As for Thomas and Emily, their fates remained entwined with the tragedy of their family. In 2033, after nearly 10 years of imprisonment, Emily's mental health deteriorated to the point where she was transferred to a psychiatric facility. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only to herself, mumbling incoherent apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Her days passed in a fog of sedation and confusion, the memories of her past weighing too heavily for her to bear. Thomas, still in prison, continued to write letters to Emily, convinced that one day they would be reunited. But in 2035, he was found dead in his cell, the cause ruled as suicide. He had left behind one final letter, addressed to Emily, in which he wrote, "I couldn't live without you. We were always meant to be together, and now we will be." The letter was never delivered, but it remained as a haunting testament to the depths of his obsession and despair. Emily, upon hearing of Thomas's death, retreated even further into herself. The news shattered what little grip on reality she had left. She spent her remaining years in the psychiatric facility, never fully recovering from the trauma of her past. The Bennett family, once the epitome of success and respectability in Springfield, had been reduced to a tragic footnote in the town's history. Springfield, though outwardly recovered, would never truly forget the events that had transpired. The memory of the Bennett family lingered in the collective consciousness of the town, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most idyllic lives, darkness could lurk. And so the tragic tale of Thomas and Emily Bennett became a permanent fixture in Springfield's folklore. Their story was passed down through the generations, not just as a tale of forbidden love and murder, but as a cautionary warning about the dangers of keeping secrets, the destructive power of obsession, and the high price of letting darkness take hold. The town, forever changed, moved forward. But for those who knew the Bennett family, the memory of what had happened would never fully fade. In the quiet corners of Springfield, in the shadows of the trees that lined the streets, it was said you could still hear whispers of the past, faint echoes of a love that should never have been, and the devastating consequences it left behind. As the years passed, Springfield's folklore surrounding the Bennett family tragedy took on a life of its own. The story became a staple of the town's haunted history tours, and local children dared each other to walk past the scorched remains of the Bennett house, claiming to hear voices or see ghostly figures in the shadows. The fire that had destroyed the house only seemed to cement its place in Springfield's collective consciousness. The once bustling street where the Bennetts had lived became quieter, with few people willing to live near the site of such a notorious and painful memory. Meanwhile, the town's residents, especially the older generation, carried the burden of the tragedy in more subtle ways. For them, it wasn't just a ghost story, it was a real, personal wound that had forever changed the town's character. People whispered about the curse of the Bennett family, though no one could say exactly when things had started to go wrong. Was it the forbidden relationship between Thomas and Emily, or had something darker taken root long before anyone noticed? Despite the fire that consumed the physical remnants of the Bennett home, the tragedy refused to fade away. The mystery of what truly led to such a catastrophic breakdown within the family persisted. As new generations grew up in Springfield, many found themselves drawn to the story, wondering how a seemingly perfect family could unravel in such a horrific way. In the fall of 2040, nearly 2 decades after the Bennett family tragedy, a documentary filmmaker named Lucas Merrick arrived in Springfield. Intent on uncovering the true story behind the infamous family, Lucas had grown up hearing the tale of Thomas and Emily, and as a true crime enthusiast, he was fascinated by the psychological complexities that had driven the siblings to commit such a devastating act. He believed that there was more to the story than what had been reported in the media at the time. Lucas's arrival stirred up old memories and unearthed buried feelings within the town. He spent months interviewing residents, including those who had known the Bennetts personally. Some were reluctant to speak, while others, especially those who had lived through the town's darkest period, were eager to share their side of the story. Many pointed to Gary, the Bennett family's former neighbor, who had been the first to notice something was wrong. Gary, now an elderly man, was still haunted by his inability to prevent the tragedy. "I knew something was off," he told Lucas during their interview. "I saw them sneaking around, saw the way they looked at each other, but I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe it was just kids being kids. I never imagined it would end like that." The more Lucas dug into the story, the more he realized that the town's collective silence over the years had allowed rumors and myths to fester. Many of the residents had conflicting accounts, some insisting that the siblings had been cursed or possessed, while others blamed the parents for not recognizing the signs of trouble earlier. Detective Julia Harper, who had investigated the case back in 2023, had long since retired, but Lucas tracked her down for an interview. "I'll never forget that case," Harper told Lucas. "It was one of the most tragic and disturbing things I've ever dealt with. Thomas and Emily weren't evil, they were lost. They got caught up in something they couldn't control, and it spiraled out of their hands. I always felt that their relationship was more a product of emotional isolation than anything else. They were too close, and with no one to turn to, they turned inward." Harper's insight shed new light on the story. Lucas realized that while the town had focused on the sensational aspects of the case, incest, murder, and mental breakdown, what had been lost in the narrative was the emotional toll that had been quietly festering beneath the surface. The Bennetts, for all their outward success, were a family suffering in silence. The pressure to maintain a perfect image, both in their personal lives and in the public eye, had pushed Thomas and Emily into a dangerous emotional cocoon. In the spring of 2041, Lucas released his documentary, Beneath the Surface: The Bennett Family Tragedy. The film delved deep into the psychological and emotional unraveling of the siblings, challenging the town's long-held assumptions about what had driven them to such desperate actions. The documentary was both acclaimed and controversial. It painted Thomas and Emily not as monsters but as victims of a system that had failed to recognize their cries for help. The documentary rekindled interest in the case, both in Springfield and beyond. Reporters and true crime enthusiasts flocked to the town, hoping to piece together more details from those who had lived there. The town, once eager to forget, found itself once again in the spotlight, with the Bennett family tragedy becoming a subject of national fascination. Yet for those who had been closest to the family, the renewed attention brought mixed feelings. Sarah Bennett, Robert's widow and the mother of Thomas and Emily, had spent the past 2 decades in near total isolation. After the trial, she had disappeared from public life, retreating to a small cabin in a nearby town where she lived quietly, cut off from the world. When Lucas attempted to contact her for the documentary, she refused to speak. Sarah had never fully recovered from the loss of her husband and the imprisonment of her children, and many believed that she had never truly come to terms with what had happened. In a rare interview shortly after the release of the documentary, Sarah's sister revealed that Sarah had been living with profound guilt. She blames herself, her sister said. She thinks that if she had just paid more attention, if she had been a better mother, none of this would have happened. But the truth is, no one saw it coming, not even her. In the end, Beneath the Surface did more than just retell a tragic story. It humanized the people at the center of it. For the first time, many viewers saw the Bennetts not just as a perfect family gone wrong, but as deeply flawed, deeply human individuals who had been pushed to their breaking point. The film sparked conversations about mental health, emotional isolation, and the pressures of maintaining appearances in small-town America. But even as the world outside of Springfield dissected the story anew, the town itself remained cautious, wary of reopening old wounds. For the people of Springfield, the Bennett family tragedy was not just a story, it was a scar, a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives could harbor unimaginable darkness. As the years rolled on, the memory of the Bennetts slowly faded from the forefront of public consciousness. But for those who had lived through it, the shadow of the tragedy would always be there, lingering just beneath the surface. A quiet reminder of how fragile the line between love and obsession, family and tragedy, can truly be.